The dust had settled on everything, her hopes, her mother's china, the last letter from the bank. Cora Jane Winslow stood at her kitchen window, watching the horizon swallow another day whole, when the silhouette appeared against the dying light. A lone rider, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had never learned to hurry toward anything but death. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the heat still trapped there from the merciless sun, and wondered if this was how the end would come, not with the bang of foreclosure papers, but with the whisper of hoofbeats on hard-pan earth. "Your mama saved me in '63. The words would soon cut through her world like a blade through silk, unraveling everything she thought she knew about enemies and salvation. The silence in the house had grown teeth. It gnawed at Cora Jane's bones as she moved through rooms that once held laughter, now holding only the ghosts of conversations that would never come again. Her bare feet whispered against the wooden floors, each step a small rebellion against the crushing weight of solitude that pressed down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The morning light filtered through windows she could no longer afford to replace, casting fractured rainbows across walls that had witnessed too much sorrow. She paused at the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the daguerreotype of her mother, Eleanor Winslow, whose gentle eyes seemed to hold secrets that had died with her 3 winters past. The woman in the photograph wore the same stubborn set to her jaw that Cora Jane saw in her own reflection, the same refusal to bend that had kept the Winslow women upright through drought, war, and the particular cruelty of men who measured a woman's worth by the strength of the man standing behind her. The kitchen table bore the evidence of her failing battle against circumstance, bills spread like tarot cards predicting a future she couldn't bear to face. The bank's final notice lay beneath her coffee cup, the words blurring together in a symphony of legal threats and impossible deadlines. 60 days. That's all the time she had left before Wounded Rock Ridge would claim another victim. Another woman who had dared to believe she could hold on to something in a world designed to take everything away. Her husband's death at Gettysburg had been swift, merciful in its finality. This slow strangulation by debt and isolation was a different kind of warfare, one that left no monuments to honor the fallen. She pressed her palms against the table's scarred surface, feeling the grooves carved by years of family meals, of her mother's rolling pin, of her own desperate attempts to make the numbers add up to something other than surrender. The ranch stretched beyond her windows, like a promise broken by time and circumstance. Cattle that had once dotted the landscape like dark stars against the golden grass had been sold off one by one, each sale a small death that brought her closer to the inevitable. The barn stood empty now except for her mare, Duchess, whose ribs showed too clearly beneath her dappled coat. Even the horse seemed to understand that their days here were numbered, that the land that had nurtured 3 generations of Winslow women would soon belong to strangers who would never know the stories buried in its soil. Cora Jane had tried everything, taking in washing, selling her mother's jewelry, even swallowing her pride to ask for credit at Morrison's store. But pride, she had learned, was a luxury she could no longer afford, and charity came with strings that threatened to strangle what little dignity she had left. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her reverie like a knife through silk. She moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs with the particular terror of a woman alone who had learned that visitors rarely brought good news. The rider emerged from the heat shimmer like a mirage given flesh, his silhouette dark against the burning sky. There was something in his posture, in the way he sat his horse, that spoke of patience, learned through suffering, of strength tempered by loss. As he drew closer, she could see the copper of his skin, the long black hair that caught the wind like a banner of defiance. Apache. The word formed in her mind with all the weight of childhood fears and newspaper headlines, of stories told around fires about savages and scalping knives. Yet something in his approach, measured, respectful, almost ceremonial, made her hand pause on the rifle that hung above the door. He stopped at the edge of her property, just beyond the broken fence that marked the boundary between her world and the vast emptiness beyond. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance, the widow in her faded calico dress and the warrior whose presence seemed to carry the weight of ancient mountains. She could see his face now, weathered by sun and wind into something that spoke of endurance beyond ordinary human measure. His eyes, dark as winter nights, held a gravity that made her breath catch in her throat. There was no threat in his posture, no aggression in the way his hands rested loose on his horse's neck. Instead, there was something that looked almost like reverence, as if he were approaching a shrine rather than a failing ranch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the space between them with the clarity of church bells, each word weighted with purpose and memory. "Your mama saved me in '63, he said, and the words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and the strength from her knees. The world tilted on its axis, and suddenly everything she thought she knew about her mother, about her family's history, about the careful boundaries that separated her world from his, crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. She gripped the window frame until her knuckles went white, her mind racing through memories of her mother's unexplained absences, of supplies that went missing from their stores, of the way Eleanor Winslow had always spoken of the Apache with a respect that bordered on reverence. "Now I'm here for you, widow," he continued, and in those words she heard the echo of an old debt coming due, of honor that transcended the artificial boundaries drawn by fear and prejudice. The Apache warrior dismounted with the fluid grace of water finding its level, each movement speaking of a lifetime spent in harmony with horse and earth. Cora Jane watched from behind her window as he approached the house, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed dirt of her yard. There was something almost ritualistic in his approach, as if he were following protocols older than the territory itself, older than the wars that had carved boundaries between their peoples. His horse, a paint stallion with eyes like polished obsidian, stood perfectly still without being tied, as if it too understood the solemnity of this moment. The afternoon sun caught the silver conchos on the warrior's belt, sending fragments of light dancing across the weathered boards of her porch. She found herself holding her breath, caught between the urge to flee and an inexplicable pull toward this man who claimed connection to her mother's hidden past. When he reached the bottom step of her porch, he stopped and removed his hat, a gesture so unexpected, so courtly, that it shattered every preconception she had carried about his people. His hair fell loose around his shoulders, black as midnight water, threaded with silver that spoke of battles fought and survived. His face, she could see now, bore the map of a hard life, scars that told stories of courage and loss, lines carved by laughter and sorrow in equal measure. But it was his eyes that undid her. Dark pools that held depths she couldn't fathom, yet somehow familiar, as if she had seen their like before in dreams or half-remembered stories. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like something sacred being handled with infinite care. "I am Taza of the Chiricahua. Your mother, Eleanor, she pulled Apache bullets from my chest when the soldiers left me for dead by Willow Creek." The memory hit her like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. Her mother returning from one of her mysterious journeys, her apron stained with blood, her hands shaking as she burned the evidence in their kitchen fire. Cora Jane had been 15 then, old enough to ask questions but young enough to accept her mother's explanation about helping a wounded deer. Now, standing face to face with this man whose very presence seemed to carry the weight of mountains, she understood that the deer had been human, that her mother's mercy had extended beyond the boundaries of race and war. "She never told me," Cora Jane whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. "She never said." But even as the words left her lips, she knew why Eleanor had kept this secret, knew the price a white woman would pay for showing kindness to an Apache warrior in a territory where hatred ran deeper than the deepest well. Taza nodded, as if he had expected this revelation to wound her. Your mother was wise to keep silent. In those days, mercy was seen as betrayal by both our peoples. But I have carried the debt of her kindness for 23 winters, and now I see her daughter struggling as she once struggled. His words were measured, careful, as if he were walking through a field of thorns and trying not to draw blood. I have watched from the high places, seen the cattle sold, seen the men from the bank come with their papers. Your mother's daughter should not face the wolves alone. The casual mention of his surveillance should have terrified her, but instead it brought an unexpected comfort. The knowledge that someone had been watching over her, that her struggles had not gone unnoticed in a world that seemed determined to grind her into dust. She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the sun-warmed boards, and for the first time in months felt something other than despair coursing through her veins. This close, she could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of hands that created beauty even in the midst of a harsh world. "What kind of debt?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer, could feel it in the way he held himself, in the gravity that seemed to emanate from his very bones. "The debt of life," he replied simply. "Your mother gave me back my breath when the soldiers thought they had taken it forever. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, yet she risked everything to show kindness to an enemy. Such a debt can only be repaid in kind." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, of a code of honor that transcended the petty boundaries drawn by governments and generals. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that seemed to echo the color of Taza's skin. Cora Jane found herself studying his face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but finding only the steady gaze of a man who had looked death in the eye and learned to speak truth as naturally as breathing. "The people in town," she said slowly, "they won't understand. They'll see you here and think." She let the words trail off, but they both knew what the townspeople would think, what conclusions they would draw about a white widow who allowed an Apache warrior onto her property. "Let them think what they will," Taza replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength of mountains that had weathered countless storms. "Your mother taught me that honor is not measured by the opinions of cowards, but by the courage to do what is right when the whole world is watching." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cora Jane felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally creaking open. The loneliness that had been her constant companion since her husband's death seemed to retreat slightly, pushed back by the presence of this man who carried her mother's secret like a sacred trust. "What are you offering?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer, could feel it in the way the evening air seemed to hum with possibility. Taza's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert, transforming his weathered features into something that spoke of hope reborn. "Everything," he said simply. "My strength, my knowledge of this land, my protection against those who would take what is yours. I offer you the same mercy your mother showed me, the chance to live when the world says you should die." The morning sun carved harsh shadows across Wounded Rock Ridge as Cora stood at her kitchen window, watching Taza work among her dying cattle. His movements held the fluid precision of a man who understood survival in its rawest form, each gesture deliberate as he examined the animals with hands that had once held weapons against her people. The irony wasn't lost on her, that salvation might come from the very source the town had taught her to fear. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the tremor in her own fingers, the way her body betrayed the careful walls she'd built around her heart since Thomas died. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered her contemplation. Sheriff Morrison rode up the dusty path with 3 other men, their faces set in the grim determination of those who believed righteousness lived in their guns. Cora's stomach clenched as she recognized the banker, Hutchins, among them. A man whose smile had grown thinner with each missed payment, whose eyes had begun to linger too long on her land, her home, her body. She smoothed her worn dress and stepped onto the porch, feeling the weight of their judgment before a single word was spoken. "Mrs. Winslow," Morrison's voice carried the authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to decide others' fates. "We've come about your situation." His gaze drifted toward Taza, who had straightened but continued his work, neither fleeing nor challenging their presence. The sheriff's hand rested casually on his gun belt, a gesture so practiced it seemed unconscious. "Folks in town are concerned about you harboring a savage on your property, especially given your vulnerable position." The word vulnerable hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying implications that made Cora's skin crawl. She understood the unspoken message that a woman alone was prey, that her choices were not her own, that protection came only through submission to men like these. "Mr. Taza is helping with my cattle," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I fail to see how that concerns anyone but myself." But even as she spoke, she felt the familiar weight of isolation pressing down on her shoulders. The knowledge that in this place, at this time, a woman's defiance could be crushed as easily as a wildflower under a boot heel. Hutchins leaned forward in his saddle, his pale eyes glittering with something that made Cora's flesh recoil. "Now, Cora, may I call you Cora? We're only thinking of your welfare. A woman in your position needs proper guidance, proper protection. There are arrangements that could be made, debts that could be forgiven, if you were willing to consider more suitable companionship." His meaning slithered between the words like a snake through tall grass, and Cora felt the familiar nausea that came with being reduced to a transaction, a problem to be solved by men who saw her body as currency. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring until Taza's voice cut through it, calm and measured as mountain stone. "The lady has made her choice." He approached with the unhurried confidence of a man who had faced death so many times it held no mystery for him. "I am here by right of old debt, by honor that runs deeper than your laws. If you have business with Mrs. Winslow, speak it plain. If you have business with me, then speak it like men." His words carried no threat, only the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting, some lines worth defending with blood if necessary. Morrison's face flushed red as desert clay, his authority challenged by a man he'd been taught to see as less than human. "You'd best watch your tongue, Apache. This territory has ways of dealing with your kind." But there was something hollow in his bluster, a recognition that Taza's stillness held more danger than all their posturing combined. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Cora realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her immediate fate, but the shape of all her tomorrows, whether she would remain a victim of other men's decisions or finally claim the right to choose her own path through the wilderness of her heart. The men rode away in a cloud of dust and muttered threats, but their presence lingered like the smell of sulfur after lightning. Cora remained on the porch long after their hoofbeats faded, her hands gripping the weathered railing, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. The confrontation had stripped away her illusions about the precariousness of her position. She was a woman alone in a world that saw solitude as invitation, independence as defiance that must be crushed. The weight of that knowledge settled into her bones like winter cold, making her feel older than her 33 years. Taza approached with the careful respect of a man who understood that some wounds were invisible, that the aftermath of humiliation required its own kind of healing. He didn't speak immediately, instead moving to check the fence posts near the house, his presence both protective and undemanding. Cora watched him work, noting how his hands, scarred from battles she could only imagine, handled the rough wood with surprising gentleness. There was something profoundly comforting about his silence, the way he offered his strength without expecting gratitude or submission in return. "They'll be back," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt like defeat, but also like the first honest thing she'd said in months. Men like that don't accept defiance from women like me. She thought of Hutchins' pale eyes, the way he'd looked at her like a piece of property to be acquired, and shuddered. The banker held her debts like chains, and they both knew it. Every missed payment tightened his grip, brought her closer to the moment when she would have no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered, terms that would cost far more than money. Taza set down his tools and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding depths she was only beginning to fathom. "Your mother faced worse," he said quietly. "In 63, when the soldiers came to burn our village, she stood between their guns and my wounded body. A white woman protecting an Apache warrior, it should have been impossible. But she saw something in me worth saving, just as I see something in you worth protecting." His words carried the weight of lived truth, of a debt that transcended the artificial boundaries men drew between peoples. The story hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Cora tried to imagine her mother, always so proper, so concerned with appearances, risking everything for a stranger, an enemy. But as she looked into Taza's face, she began to understand that courage wasn't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it was as quiet as choosing compassion over fear, as simple as seeing the humanity in someone the world had taught you to hate. "She never told me," Cora whispered, feeling the familiar ache of all the conversations they would never have, all the wisdom that had died with her mother's last breath. "Some gifts are too precious for words," Taza replied, moving closer but stopping just beyond arm's reach, respecting the invisible boundaries that still existed between them. "She gave me life when I had lost all hope. Now I offer you the same. Not just protection from men like those, but the chance to remember who you are beneath all their expectations. You are not their victim, Cora Winslow. You are your mother's daughter, and that blood carries strength they cannot break." His voice held the certainty of prophecy, and for the first time in months, Cora felt something stir in her chest that might have been hope. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Cora made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. "Stay," she said, the word emerging from some deep place she'd forgotten existed. "Not just for tonight, but stay. Help me fight them. Help me find whatever strength my mother saw in you, whatever courage she passed down to me." The request hung between them like a prayer. Fragile and desperate, and absolutely necessary. In that moment, she understood that salvation sometimes came wearing the face of everything you'd been taught to fear, and that the greatest act of rebellion might be learning to trust your own heart over the world's cruel whispers. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands, each day bringing small revelations that shifted the landscape of Cora's understanding. She watched Taza work with her cattle, his knowledge of the land revealing itself in ways that humbled her. How he could read the sky for weather changes days in advance, how his hands could coax life from soil that seemed barren to her untrained eyes. The ranch began to breathe again under his care, and with it, something in Cora's chest loosened. Like a fist that had been clenched so long, she'd forgotten what open fingers felt like. The town's hostility grew more pronounced with each passing day. Supplies became harder to obtain. Neighbors who had once offered grudging sympathy now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Mrs. Henderson, who had brought casseroles after Thomas died, now whispered behind her fan at church, her eyes bright with the particular cruelty of women who had never been forced to choose between survival and respectability. Cora felt the weight of their judgment like stones in her pockets, dragging her down with each step through the dusty streets of Wounded Rock Ridge. But in the evenings, when the work was done, and the desert air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, she discovered something she hadn't expected. Conversation that fed her starved spirit. Taza spoke of his people's ways, of a time before the wars when the land itself was teacher and provider. His words painted pictures of a world where strength and gentleness could coexist, where a woman's wisdom was valued as highly as a man's courage. Listening to him, Cora began to understand how small her world had become, how the boundaries others had drawn around her life were not natural laws, but choices she could unmake. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Taza spoke of his wife, a woman who had died in the same raid that nearly claimed his life, the raid where Cora's mother had intervened. She was fierce, he said, his voice carrying the particular tenderness reserved for the beloved dead, like a hawk protecting her nest. She would have liked your mother, I think. They both understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Maji, his words created a bridge between past and present, between loss and possibility, and Cora felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but the deeper ache of healing. The silence that followed was different from the careful distances they had maintained. This was the silence of two people who had learned to trust the spaces between words. Cora found herself studying his profile in the starlight, noting the way sorrow and strength had carved themselves into the lines around his eyes. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt the stirring of something that wasn't just gratitude or desperation, but recognition, the way one wounded creature recognizes another, the way survivors learn to read the language of shared endurance. When Hutchins arrived the next morning with legal papers and a sheriff's escort, Cora was ready. She stood on her porch with Taza beside her, no longer the desperate widow who had begged for more time, but a woman who had remembered her own name. "I'm not signing," she said, her voice carrying across the yard like a bell. "This land is mine, bought with my husband's blood and my own sweat. If you want it, you'll have to take it by force. And then the whole territory will know what kind of men you really are." The words felt like armor, like weapons, like the first breath after nearly drowning, and she understood finally that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to choose love over safety, truth over survival, the unknown territory of her own heart over the familiar prison of others' expectations.